Hello, welcome to Cherry Bekaert's GovCon podcast, where we discuss current government contracting trends, compliance matters, and best practices to guide federal contractors forward. My name is Eric Poppe. I'm a senior manager with Cherry Bekaert's Government Contract Services Group, and with me today is Susan Moser, the leader of Cherry Bekaert's Government Contract Services Group. Susan, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks. Happy to be here. Always enjoy talking about the 8A program. So quick background on me. So I started this firm's practice 20 plus years ago after having been a client of the firm, as a controller and then a CFO for two different 8A companies. So I've basically spent most of my career working with 8A companies. So as I think we've said in some of our other podcast series, we're very bullish on the 8A program, and we're excited to help companies learn more about how to be successful in it.
Yeah, and this is our fourth podcast in this series on the 8A program overall, and we get a lot of, and today we wanted to talk a little bit more on the contractual process and, sole source awards. We get a lot of questions that relate to, hey, I've just got into the 8A program. I'm a new company, and I'm really excited to get my first 8A award, and especially sole source. But what are things I need to be worried about, or potential pitfalls, or what's involved with that process? Do you mind just to start us off, just giving a little bit of overview of the 8A contracting process and sole source awards?
Sure, happy to do that. So just a little background. So Section 8A, so the term 8A contractors comes from Section 8A of the Small Business Act, which is what established the program that authorized the SBA to enter into all types of contracts with other agencies, really on behalf of small businesses. So the SBA is actually contracting with agencies for small business contracts. So the 8A program is really the 8A Business Development Program, commonly called the 8A program. And a small business is accepted into the program, and then they're called a participant. And so they're actually considered subcontractors of the SBA. And so the 8A program, as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, it is a 9-year program, and it does give companies the opportunity to compete with limited competition. So 8A contractors can be awarded contracts on a sole source basis or on a competitive basis. So the SBA is actually certifying to those agencies that the SBA is competent and responsible to perform those contracts. And then they are actually subcontracting. So a long time ago, they used to have what they called a tripart agreement, where both the agency, the SBA, and the contractor had to sign off on a contract. For the most part, most agencies have entered into memorandums of understanding, and so it's a little more seamless. But basically, the SBA can award, there's competitive contracts. So a competitive contract is awarded if there is a reasonable expectation that there's at least 2 qualified 8A small businesses that can submit offers. If the resulting contract can be awarded at a fair market price, if the government estimates that the value will exceed $7.5 million for manufacturing or $4.5 million for all other requirements, i.e. services, and if it hasn't already been accepted as a sole source award on behalf of a tribal owned or American Alaska Native corporation, then those would be 8A competitive. So if it's more than $7.5 million for manufacturing, $4.5 million for services, it would be competitive. But it can be awarded as a sole source 8A if they can determine that there's a qualified small business that's responsible. The government feels like the contract can be awarded at a fair market price, and that the government estimate doesn't exceed that $7.5 million for manufacturing or $4.5 million for all other requirements. And there are situations where sole source contracts can be awarded for more than those dollar thresholds. Alaskan Native, tribally owned 8As, they actually are eligible for higher dollar value sole source awards. Agencies actually can award 8A sole source contracts up to 22 million, but they have to use sole source justification. Last year, actually, the DoD introduced an opportunity for 8A sole source awards up to 100 million, but sole source justification is required. So, for a lot of commercial companies, I mean, the opportunity to receive a sole source award, say if it's services for $4.5 million, where you're not competing against other companies is pretty remarkable. One thing I wanted to mention, because I know we get a lot of questions about, well, how many sole source contracts can you get? So there are limitations. In general, 8A firms can't receive additional 8A sole source awards once they have a combined total, both competitive and sole source awards in excess of $100 million. So once you get to $100 million in contract awards, kind of makes sense that they would limit your ability to have sole source awards. There are some other for companies that are based on their sizes, based on numbers of employees. There's different mechanics, but in addition, during companies, so I mentioned earlier that the 8A program is a 9-year program. So when companies are in the transitional stage, or really the last 5 years of participation, there are targets in terms of the number of non-8A awards that you have to meet before the SBA would accept sole source contracts on your behalf, and so those are different for each year. But basically, the whole program, point of the program is to make you a viable, competitive business once you get out of the program. And so what they don't want to do is let you get too reliant on sole source awards. So they do limit your ability to get sole source awards as you progress throughout the program.
Well, and to take a little bit of a step back, you mentioned earlier that it can be competitive awarded or sole source, and the agencies have to, pretty much they have to notify SBA or almost apply to say, hey, we have this acquisition program that we want to award as an 8A sole source. And don't they have to give, correct me if I'm wrong, estimated period of performance, the NAICS codes, a description of the work, contract type considerations and history, or if there's special restrictions of some sort?
Yep. So basically, once a contract gets into the 8A program, it's honestly, it's hard to get out of the 8A program. But there's really a couple of different ways that acquisitions are really selected for the 8A program. The SBA can advise an agency of an 8A participant's capabilities through a search letter. Either, the SBA can send it, or the contracting activity can request, potential participants to identify acquisitions to support, specific 8A companies. The SBA can also require 8A participants send letters to or contact each agency. Generally has an Office of Small Disadvantaged Business Utilization. They call them SADBUs. DoD, they're called the Office of Small Business Programs. The SBA can request contracting officers offer acquisitions to the 8A program. So those small business utilization offices, those are really, they're meant to be advocates for small business. If there's a particular agency that somebody's interested, you should definitely get to know the SADBU office for those agencies and contact them, make them aware of your capabilities. They do, again, get requests through SBA, but a lot of it is also marketing. The third way, which is probably the most common, is agencies can review their proposed acquisitions for the purposes of identifying requirements that can be offered to the SBA for those programs. Those agencies can either, self-market to 8A participants to identify, qualified companies, or they can reach out to, again, the small business utilization offices or the SBA. So, most agencies are pretty good about wanting and advocating for 8A. It is an easy way for them to contract, and so you don't usually have to educate many agencies on the use of sole source contract vehicles.
I just, that's such a great name, Sad Boo. I do, every time I hear it, it makes me chuckle. So it's interesting how, companies, if you're an 8A and you get a sole source award, it brings another hurdle though that I think that people or companies forget about a lot, and that's the pricing aspect and the costing piece that goes into the price. And so how SBA, if they are awarding a sole source, it really needs to be contracted under subpart 15 of the FAR. And, that brings on cost and pricing data and, needing to be able to put together a fair and reasonable price and show that support, which I feel like that's like the hidden piece that a lot of companies don't really realize.
It is. So, one of the things, so if you think about, if you have the opportunity, so the government, has an overall objective to pay fair and reasonable prices and to ensure competition. And so typically in an 8A competitive, they're evaluating your price and your proposal against other companies. So in a sole source, you're obviously not competing with anyone, but the government still has a requirement to make sure that that's one of the requirements. They need to make sure that they're getting a reasonable price. And so the only way that the government can do that is they have a number, they have to go through cost and price analysis. And so oftentimes they can do some price analysis, but if you're not competing, and sometimes it may be a requirement that's a unique requirement. And so the government is going to ask you to put together a proposal and to show, even if it's fixed price. A lot of people like to think fixed price, I don't have to show all how I came up with my costs. But in a limited competition, sole source, the government actually does have a right to ask for that information. And so I always tell people, a sole source award, that's your best opportunity to maximize and to get a good price. But you have to really be able to demonstrate how you came up with those costs, and they're justified. And so I think, Eric, you all the time help companies with proposals, typically in a competitive situation, but maybe just talk a little bit about, what are those things that you have to put, what do you need to put together if you are submitting a sole source award, for your price?
Yeah, happy to. When you're putting together, it all comes down to the basis of estimates and having having the documentation to support that proposed cost. And it can't just be, historical reference and past performance as a component of that, but it can't just be, hey, this is what the market will take, or it can't just be, I know the customer and this is what the customer is going to want to see. There needs to be you need to be able to justify and show the reasonableness of how you came up with the proposed cost and the components that make up the cost. So, for example, if it's direct labor, you need to be able to show what the salary, the basis for the salary information, and also the basis for the hours too. And if for salary, for example, it could be historical current employees and what their actuals are, but it also might be market research and escalation for out years and labor indices. For hours, it might be you historical for past performance, but also maybe if there's learning curves or things like that you need to consider. Material, it's again, you could always go back to the historical, but quotes and getting actual estimates from suppliers potentially, and getting multiple to show, hey, we aren't just saying that this is the market price. And also again, escalation. Same with indirects, and how do you handle single year, multi-year indirect rates? Profit, you even need to show your reasonableness for profit too. So all the different components that make up your proposal, you have to be able to take back to the detail and to the source information to be able to justify it. So oh, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is, even if so often with sole source contracts, the contracting officer will use the standard form 26 as the contract form, and they will typically ask you to prepare a proposal. But a lot of times that when they ask you to put together a proposal, it's not like a competitive where it's a very standardized or asking for, you know, your technical approach. You typically don't have to write a voluminous technical volume. Sometimes you do, but they may not initially ask for a lot of detail on price. And a lot of times, this is a mistake companies make, is they may know that the budget for this contract, or they know that this, you know, if it's a services contract, it can't be awarded for more than $4.5 million. And so they think that's the budget. And so they, you know, want to come up with a price that's, you know, 4.4 million. And, you know, sometimes in the original request from the government, it may ask for your price, but it may not ask for all that detail that you were just talking about. But you need to be prepared to provide that when asked, and that it makes sense, and that it's reasonable. And so for companies that are not familiar and haven't done that before, you know, it is your best shot, but it's also an easy way for companies to make, you know, I'll call them rookie mistakes. And I'll kind of put that in quotes. You know, understandably, maybe your first contract or your first significant government contract, and so you want to make sure that you do have a good basis for how you came up with that.
Yeah, and then you're not scrambling trying to find the documentation after the fact, after they do request to have a cost proposal audit of some sort. I think some of the best practices is while you're going through the creating that price and going through the cost estimating process, is putting together the files for each cost element as you do the build up, and to have the source documentation there readily available. And then you start to use that as a repository for future proposals too, as you continue to grow. And hopefully, you know, you mentioned the 9-year runway, you start to grow and you have more justification that you can use for cost proposals, and you start to win more competitive work, and you hopefully evolve out of the program eventually.
Yep. You know, a couple other things for companies to be aware of, especially on your first sole source. So sometimes a contracting officer can request a pre-award survey of the 8A company. Certainly depends on the type of contract. Even if it's a fixed price contract, you typically, when we think of pre-award surveys, a lot of times we think of those as accounting system surveys. So sometimes they will ask for those, but they can also ask for a you know, financial capability assessment or a certificate from the SBA of competency. So they want to make sure, again, ultimately they're really contracting with the SBA, and the SBA is there to support the contractor. But you know, sometimes they do ask for additional information to, again, give them, you know, confidence that they'll be able to perform. One thing a couple things just to also sort of caution companies. So a couple things the government can't do, and it doesn't mean that I haven't seen them try in the past, especially when you know, we're getting to the very end of the government's year end. And so when, you know, lots of contract dollars are awarded in the month of September, and a lot of 8A companies, a lot of 8A contracts, and a lot of sole source contracts. And you know, contracting officers cannot break up different, you know, sort of requirements into pieces in order to, you know, award multiple sole source contracts to one company that are more than the threshold. And so there's a lot of things. Once a contract is in the 8A program, it typically stays in the program. The follow-on requirements, so typically if they issue one, there is a requirement, and so just because you had one sole source contract doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be the recipient the next year. Again, depends on, you know, how many other contracts you've been awarded and that type of thing. But once they're in the program, generally they stay, and it's hard to get them out. And again, with, I think, good reason, until you get close to graduation, and then you're looking for ways to for them to not be in the 8A program.
So, you know, we're coming up on the end of this episode on sole source awards and the 8A program, within the 8A program. do you have any closing thoughts for a new 8A that's trying to win its first sole source, and just from a documentation standpoint or a process standpoint, any just tips or tricks that you could provide?
Yep. So again, I think, the first is really identifying those agencies that you either are already doing business with, that you want to do business. Some agencies are more prone and adept at 8A contract awards. So I think, do take advantage of those SADBU offices and of the SBA to help you with, identifying opportunities for sole source awards. I would say don't get too reliant on them. I mean, we have had situations where companies, they've done a good job of getting sole source contracts, but they've really not. A sole source contract is really a stepping stone. I mean, it's a great opportunity. You should go into it with your eyes wide open. You should make sure, get the help you need to make sure that you do price it to make money if it's going to be a fixed price, but also that you can demonstrate and validate that you are providing a basis for estimate, that it's fair and reasonable, and that you can perform, and then take advantage of it. So again, it's a great stepping stone to prepare you to 8A competitive contracts, which I think is going to be our topic of our next podcast.
Yep, it is, and just one other. It's a great way to get relationships with those agencies that a company might want to is, attending their industry days. And I know there are multiple associations out there that offer matchmaking with agencies to potentially find those awards. So anyways, Susan, thank you very much for talking with me today about sole source in the 8A program. And everyone, please tune in next time in the podcast series on 8As.
Thanks, everybody.